We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country.
That's a clip from a video of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking at a Washington think tank event in May. It's a video that went viral on social media, attracting more than 1 million views. Only that's not what Pelosi actually sounded like. The tape of Pelosi speaking was deliberately slowed down to make her sound like she was sluggish and slurring her words, maybe drunk. It was the latest example of the danger of fake videos, a new arsenal in the global information wars. A just-released report from NYU University warns that both foreign and domestic actors are likely gearing up for next year's presidential race by developing increasingly deceptive ways to distort the news, manipulate audio and video feeds, and poison the minds of American voters. It would be a replay of sorts of what the Russians did in 2016, only more sophisticated and potentially a lot more effective. Are social media companies doing enough to combat the threat? And is the U.S. government paying enough attention? We'll talk to the author of the NYU report, and we'll talk to one of the FBI's most celebrated former agents, Ali Soufan, about the recent Justice Department Inspector General report on former FBI Director James Comey and the impending Afghan peace deal, all on this episode of Skullduggery.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
There will be no lies. We will honor the American people with the truth and nothing else.
I'm Michael Isikoff, Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News.
And I'm Dan Kleidman, Editor-in-Chief of Yahoo News.
So we're going to be talking about two reports on this show, and both of them are pretty scary in their own ways. The disinformation report from Paul Barrett of NYU really lays out all the emerging technologies and techniques that disinformation folks, both foreign governments, Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, are likely to be doing in 2020. And the Inspector General report, for its own reasons, I found pretty chilling because of its articulation of FBI rules, which basically the Inspector General is saying forbids current and former FBI agents from talking about FBI matters without advance permission from the Bureau.
I mean, that's all we've done in our career. Is call, current and former FBI officials to get information about what they were doing.
Right, and it's how we've done some of our best stories about what the FBI was up to, both positive and negative for the Bureau. But the idea that we can't call former FBI agents or email them and talk to them about what they were doing at the FBI, cases they worked on, that is a real would be a real blow to the public's right to know if it was rigidly enforced.
I thought that was, in some ways, for that reason and other reasons, kind of a troubling report. I think that the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, had a bit of a forest for the trees problem.
Right.
I mean, the reality is that Comey wanted to get these memos out because the President of the United States was obstructing, in his view, and I think there was evidence to support that, a pretty serious investigation. Our former, our friend and regular Skullduggery guest, Matt Miller said an interesting thing, I think maybe on Twitter, which is it was kind of like giving Comey a speeding ticket on the way to telling a village that a fire was coming and it was going to burn it down.
Right. Now, look, that doesn't mean Comey is blameless here, and
Not
I don't
at
mean
all.
to be
Not at all.
defending James Comey. I think his judgment can be questioned about a lot of things.
And we're going to see, perhaps,
did.
in the next Inspector General report,
Right.
some of that laid out. We'll see.
Right. But what they nicked him for here, or at least the way they articulated what the rules are for current and former FBI agents, was pretty troubling, and we'll get into that with Ollie. A couple of other matters we want to quickly mention. We've talked a couple times on this show about Greg Craig, who was charged with essentially lying to the Justice Department about the work he did on behalf of Paul Manafort to make the Ukrainian government's persecution of one of its political opponents look better than it really was. He's just been acquitted. Not a huge surprise. I sat in on the cross-examination of Greg Craig, and while I thought the prosecutors had some stuff that didn't make Greg Craig look great, the idea that it was enough to turn him into a convicted felon fell way short.
Didn't seem like it was too tough for this D.C. jury. I think they deliberated for 4 hours.
Right. I noticed, and I noticed from the get-go the prosecutors were going to have a problem, because when I sat in on the cross-examination, and Greg Craig would occasionally make comments that intended to be amusing or flip, and there was at least one juror that was laughing at everything he said, and I think when you see that, is that this guy's on your side.
Yeah. Well, look, it was not. I think it wasn't a strong case from the beginning. We actually had our former Newsweek colleague Stuart Taylor on the show. I think right after the indictment,
right,
and he really eviscerated the case. He made a pretty persuasive argument that this was a case that never should have been brought. And in fact, and I think this speaks to the weakness of the case, it was brought to the Southern District of New York, and they basically passed on it, and it ended up with the U.S. Attorney in Washington.
Right. Now, Greg Craig, of course, was of interest because he, longtime Washington lawyer, leading Democrat, Barack Obama's first White House counsel, led the impeachment defense in the Senate for Bill Clinton. So it's a blow to go after a high-profile figure like that and lose. I wonder if this is going to impact the still looming decision about whether they indict Andrew McCabe, the former deputy director of the FBI. Remember, Horowitz referred the case to the Justice Department criminal division, concluding that McCabe had lied about whether he had authorized a leak to the media. It seems like it's a marginal case based on what we know about it right now, and obviously it's not a slam dunk or they would have already indicted him. But after losing this one, would they want to stick? Will Bill Barr, the Attorney General, authorize another case that could blow up in the Justice Department's face?
Yeah, that's a good point. These false statements cases are always tough to bring in the first place, so they may be having second thoughts.
Lots to talk about, but before we do, I want to remind all our listeners that they can follow us on @SkulduggeryPod on Twitter. And by the way, if you've got comments or questions that you'd like us to address on the show, have at it, and we'll take them under advisement. All right, we are now joined by one of our favorite FBI agents, Ali Soufan, for years. The Bureau's chief expert on al-Qaeda, worked many of his al-Qaeda cases, worked with James Comey at one point, went back when he was the U.S. attorney here in the Southern District in New York. Ali, welcome back to Skullduggery.
Always great to be with you guys.
So we had this blistering report from the Justice Department Inspector General taking Comey to task the other day for his dissemination of his memos that he wrote about his conversations with the president. I want to read you just a couple of lines from that report. The conclusion: the responsibility to protect sensitive law enforcement information falls in large part to the employees of the FBI. Former Director Comey failed to live up to this responsibility by not safeguarding sensitive information obtained during the course of his FBI employment, and by using it to create public pressure for official action. Comey set a dangerous example for the over 35,000 current FBI employees and many thousands of more FBI employees who similarly have access to the knowledge of non-public information. Ali, do you agree?
It's an IG investigation. And when the IG, when they do an investigation, they always look for every single thing that a person did wrong, and they include it in their investigation. But towards the end, the conclusion of the IG investigation, should we prosecute or not? Did they violate the law or not? Did they divulge classified information or not? Was very clear. It said, and I quote here, "We found no evidence that Comey or his attorneys released any of the classified information contained in any of the memos to members of the media." So basically,
to members of the media, they say he did disseminate that to three of his lawyers.
Three of his lawyers, but in this it said nor his lawyers. So it wasn't him or his attorneys released
who
any
disclosed
of
to the press.
They said that they don't have any evidence that the lawyers, his lawyers, released any classified information to the media. Look, towards the end, I want to have the tale of two reports. You have a report against the President of the United States by another former director of the FBI, Director Mueller. In that report, he found that the President of the United States, on numerous occasions, broke the law. And
well, he did not conclude that. Mueller said he was barred from reaching such a conclusion because of Justice Department policy that a president cannot be indicted.
I disagree with your assessment in that. On technicality, you might be right. But they said, okay, if he wasn't the President of the United States, will he be prosecuted? When he testified, he said, yes, he will be prosecuted. He can be prosecuted.
He walked that back. That's what he originally said to, I think it was Ted Lieu in the morning before Judiciary, then Intelligence. He said, I misspoke. I was saying we did not reach a conclusion as to whether the president violated the law because of this Justice Department policy.
He did not reach a conclusion. However, if that person was not the President of the United States, he could have been prosecuted. But because of the Attorney General's policy or because of the OLC policy, that basically states, and this is a policy, this is not the law, it states that you cannot indict a sitting president. That's why, That's why he couldn't indict him. So he found out, which means that there are evidence, and I think there's about 9 of them in the report, where the president obviously, did something he shouldn't do as a president,
Yes.
And if he wasn't a president, if he was Ali Soufan or Michael Isikoff, he could have been prosecuted. But because he's a president, he cannot be indicted. He needs to be impeached. And Comey made it very clear in his report and in the House. Mueller made it very clear in his report and when he testified, that's up to Congress to take over the investigation now on what happened with him. So this is one report, right? The moment it came out, immediately they said total exoneration. Total exoneration of a guy on multiple occasions broke the law just because they couldn't indict him. There's another report in Comey that said they found no evidence he released the classified information to the media, which is the main substance of the IG report. And they said, see, leaker and liars. Come on, if you guys want to be fair for everyone.
You're not suggesting there's hypocrisy in Washington, are you,
Can you
Ali?
believe that? But I think I'm suggested that also people in the media need to basically keep that in mind when they are talking about Comey and when they are talking about Trump, and keep in mind the situation of what happened. The reason Comey wrote these memos is basically more dangerous than him releasing the memos. The reason he wrote these memos is because he realized, my God, this guy, this president of the United States is breaking the law. Right. And he wanted to document it. And how do you document it in the FBI? You open a case on the president of the United States? No, you do it on your personal computer. I just want to put that memo that happened between me and him. Now, did he do the right thing? Did he violate policy? Didn't he? I don't know the details. I don't know. Maybe
actually,
he violated
that's an important question. But do you think he did the right thing? I mean, I think what he would say is, this is bogus. I was publicly faulted by the Inspector General for making public the fact that the President of the United States was trying to obstruct a very serious investigation.
And that's something.
So did he do the right thing?
Yes, because of his action, because of Comey's actions, we had Mueller. And because of Mueller's report, we know that, yes, the executive branch or the president violated the law in at least 9 different occasions. And because of that, we have the hearings that we have in Congress. Now, people didn't follow up on that. The House doesn't have the backbone to impeach. A lot of politics into this situation. That's a totally different situation. But yes, I mean, look, you find something illegal, you find something suspicious, you want to document that. And when somebody attacks you and start destroying your credibility and the credibility of the organization that you represent, you know, what you do is you try to fight back. And he fought back. And the Inspector General found out that he did not release any classified information. This is the bottom line. The bottom line in these was there any classified information released? Okay, there was none, according to the IG. Now, did he violate all these different rules and regulations? And that, my God, you know, the B in the FBI stands for bureaucracy. There are so many rules and regulations and policy, and the Inspector General gonna find something on anyone that they open an investigation on. You know, nobody can be 100% kosher in obeying all the different rules. We don't even know all the different rules, but I'm sure he violated a couple of rules, and they mentioned it in the report. But did he violate the law?
Right. He violated his non-disclosure agreement, which all FBI employees sign.
Yeah.
But violating the non-disclosure agreement is mostly about classified information. They said he didn't violate the classified information. He talked about the FBI. He talked about things that was happening in the FBI. That is a debatable issue, and that's why probably they didn't want it to prosecute, because that's a debatable issue. You know, now we cannot talk about something that's not classified, something that's being discussed in the public domain, and he put his input on it as a FBI director or a former FBI director. These are things that we have to keep in mind. I'm not saying
it was retroactively classified.
This is the content of one of the memos was retroactively classified because it included the name of a foreign leader of a foreign country that the president had mentioned in his
and at the time, Comey
meeting.
was the FBI director, so the decision whether it was classified or not flowed from the president down through the director of the FBI.
I mean, look, any classified information, releasing classified information is against the law, and a person who did it should be held accountable. I don't know the details of the Comey investigation, but I know that the IG said he did not release any classified information.
And I have to say,
that's what I know.
On the non-disclosure rule, I found there was just one passage in that report that I found absolutely chilling as a journalist and as a member of the public, in which Michael Horowitz, the IG, says, before disclosing FBI information outside of the FBI for non-official purposes, current or former FBI personnel must obtain, with limited exceptions, advance permission from the FBI. This policy applies to any type of disclosure, whether oral, written, or electronic. FBI employees agree to be bound by this requirement. Now, how many times have I, as a reporter, called you, and I'm sure hundreds of other reporters called you to talk about FBI matters when you were in the Bureau? I should point out that Ali is a former FBI agent, not a current FBI agent. But you have talked freely about your experiences in the FBI. You've written a book about your experiences in the FBI. There's a story on the wall there from Newsweek, a brilliant story, as I remember, about your days in the FBI.
Yeah, written by that guy, Michael Essex.
Brilliantly edited, by the way,
by Dan.
Yeah. Okay. And, the idea that we as journalists would not be able to talk to people like you, it seems to me would severely restrict the public's right to know about what happens in federal law enforcement.
I think it is about classified information, sensitive information, law enforcement sensitive information.
Right.
If this is how they want to run the IG's office, they're going to be having investigations on hundreds and hundreds of people who are on TV all the time as former FBI agents talking about
Yeah.
what the FBI will do in foreign counterintelligence investigation or in domestic terrorism investigation or an active shooter investigation.
Yeah.
What is the FBI policies and rules? How do they deal with local law enforcement? We see that on Fox, we see that on MSNBC, on CNN, on CBS, on ABC. Many former FBI agents talking to the public based on their experience that they had in the FBI. Yes, when it comes to classified information, sensitive information,
Or grand jury information.
or grand jury information, absolutely. I agree 100% with what the Inspector General is saying.
Right.
When I was talking about my experiences when I left, all the things, even my statement to Congress was approved by the FBI. My op-eds used to be approved by the FBI. I have no problem with that, and the process is very, very simple. But the sentence that you wrote, you read, it talks about any FBI information,
Right.
not sensitive
Well,
FBI,
okay, so
not
let me
classified.
just stop you for a second,
This is. I put
Ali,
some question marks on
because
this.
there is one of the memos that's in question here. The IG said was law enforcement sensitive, and this has to do with Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, and this is the meeting that Comey has with Trump, where Trump says, "Can you see clear to letting him go?" And that Comey memorializes that because he sees that as a potential obstruction of justice, and Horowitz says that had to do with a potential criminal investigation, which it became, and that therefore was law enforcement sensitive. Is that not a problem?
I am not a lawyer, but at the time, he's saying potentially it might be down the road.
Yeah.
From what you're saying
Yeah.
now. I mean, potentially everything might be something.
And actually, I should say, I mean,
I am not
on
saying,
the other side,
look,
I think that Sally Yates
had already made public the
had-
fact that the FBI had interviewed
Exactly.
Right,
Flynn
right.
So-
about his conversations with the Russian ambassador.
Right, and it was known. It was public information at
Right.
that time. So I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind, I'm not saying that Comey, I probably have a lot of criticism for Comey on different things, but I am saying that when it comes to this, towards the end, an Inspector General will look if a person broke the law or not. Can they be indicted or not? Are they to be prosecuted or not? And it's very clear in the report that they said he did not share classified information, he did not break any law, and they're not going to do any prosecution. Now, did he violate policy, internal policy in the FBI? From their view of things, okay, they did. And if you look at any Inspector General, I think I don't recall I read one Inspector General that said, "Oh, the guy's clear like a whistle. They didn't do anything."
Yeah.
Because if somebody is clear like a whistle, they didn't do anything. That's mean they are not working.
Right.
Well, that's
So-
actually an interesting point because, if FBI agents spend all their time having to navigate these bureaucratic rules and regulations and policies,
Right.
Then, it becomes harder to do their job.
I'll give you an
It
example.
creates a kind of
I'll
risk
give you-
aversion.
I'll give you an example. There is sometimes when you do an interview, there is a specific days. Like I don't remember from the top of my head, 4 or 5 days, and you have to finalize the interview in a report. Sometimes when you're sitting working in a place like Yemen, for example, you're doing 10 different interviews at the same time. There's no way you can finalize that interview in 5 days. So if there is something happened because you had a car accident and the IG started an investigation to see if you're wrong or right, and they start looking at all your records. They say, "Oh, this guy, he was waiting 10 days to finalize his report. He broke the rules of the FBI." I mean, you can go down that path, but towards the end, did anybody break the law? That's a totally different situation. And I go to two reports. One report, it was obvious that the person who broke the law, but we cannot say they broke the law because he's the president of the United States. Only Congress can say they broke the law. And one guy did not break the law. This is the official investigation, did not break the law. And they say, "Hey, he's a leaker and a liar." See? It's very obvious. I think we just need to be fair when we talk about this. Comey is not an angel. Comey did a lot of things that can be questionable.
Such as what?
I mean, there are other stuff, for example, about the when that happened, for example, when the president asked him, somebody can make the argument, why didn't you go directly to Congress? Or why didn't you resign immediately when something like this happened? Why didn't you, so we can second guess, but towards the end, it's very difficult to put ourselves in his shoes. Not every day the president of the United States.
It was an unorthodox thing to do.
Unorthodox.
To go to your friend who's a lawyer and ask him to then leak, memos to the New York Times.
We live in unorthodox times. It is unorthodox to have president talking to the FBI director in a way that, hey, as if it's John Gotti talking, hey, man, send me the bull. He's a good guy. Let him go.
True.
I mean, it's an unorthodox situation.
I should
for somebody
point out,
like Comey, who spent his years, in DOJ and in the FBI.
Yeah.
I mean, among FBI people, probably I will do a lot of criticism against some of the stuff that Comey did during his time period in the FBI, from trusting the wrong people to and
the handling of the Hillary email investigation.
Exactly, the Hillary. But now I'm not talking about all these things. We're not talking about James Comey. We're talking about the Inspector General report on James Comey. And for me, the Inspector General report on James Comey did not say that James Comey lied. They had a problem with the way he told the truth. And this is two different things. Right?
And he didn't immediately disclose to the FBI that he had these memos at home. There were things that clearly he could be
put yourself
second guessed
You're
about.
The director of the FBI. You go back to all your lieutenants and you want to tell them, hey, the president of the United States just did that, or it's gonna be, it's a weird, awkward situation. I mean, the only time that we had situation like this, I believe, on that scale, was with Nixon.
Right.
And at the time, the assistant director of the FBI really violated the law. Deep throat. He actually gave the information to the media in order to protect the nation and protect the institutions. But that guy really violated the law. But Comey was in a very awkward position with this. Did he do it? I think his intention was to protect the institution, to protect the FBI. His intention was to protect the DOJ. I think he decided to fall on the sword for DOJ during the Hillary investigation, and he paid dearly for it, and the nation paid dearly for it. So there's a lot of things that we can criticize Comey and say, okay, is this right or is this wrong? But towards the end, let's look at the Inspector General conclusion. We found no evidence that Comey or his attorneys released any of the classified information contained in the memo to members of the media. He did not release classified information. This is the bottom line of the Inspector General report. Now, he was speeding at one day and he violated the law. That's a totally different situation.
Let me ask you, this is the first of two Inspector General reports that are expected. There's another one coming that a lot of people in Washington think is going to be much more serious and consequential, and that is the report on the FISA process and the FISA warrant that the FBI got on Carter Page, the foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. You've had a lot of experience with FISA because you were doing all sorts of classified investigations relating to terrorism, and the question there is whether the FBI improperly used an opposition research document, i.e. the Steele dossier, and presented it to the FISA court as a basis for getting that warrant when that opposition research document had not been corroborated by the FBI. What are you expecting from that report, and how serious, if the IG finds that the FBI violated policies there, whether you think that would be more serious?
Well, yeah, if they found that they violated policies on FISA, that probably gonna open a can of worms on the issue of FISA by itself. Right. I don't know. I don't want to prejudge what the Inspector General will say, but I think from what I hear from people that that dossier was not the cornerstone of the FISA on on that specific subject. But I don't know. I mean, I don't want to talk about something that I really
It
don't
clearly
know.
was in there because some of it has been unredacted.
Look, it is in there, but is it the main reason it's in there? Is the whole FISA based on that, based on singular information from a singular source? That is a totally different topic than if it's included in the FISA application, right? It's two different things. My experience with FISA, it's very strict. There's a lot of things you need to do in your local office, and then in headquarters, and then and then the FBI director, they sign the FISA, it goes to the Attorney General, and then you have the FISA court, 4 different judges. Those judges, by the way, are all Republicans, all conservative judges, and they are very strict. And if they know that you're lying to them or trying to deceive them, your career is over. So my experience with the FISA with the FISA court, with the FISA in general, the FISA process is very different than what I read now in the papers. And I'm not involved in that because I'm not in the FBI and I don't have any inside information on that.
All right, let me change topics quickly and ask you about something that seems pretty significant, but is not getting a whole lot of attention in the press and is not a big part of the conversation, which is we appear to be very close to a deal, the United States, with the Taliban and finally ending our, 18-year involvement in that country.
Yeah.
You have spent the better part of your career dealing with groups like the Taliban, international terrorism, and the fallout from 9/11. What is your reaction to the deal that is being discussed? We would be withdrawing all of our troops, I think 5,000 at first, but ultimately all of them, agreeing to let the Taliban be involved in some power-sharing arrangement in Kabul. What do you make of it?
I think, look, I more than anyone else, I want to end the war in Afghanistan and bring the troops home, right? So, but also at the same time, I am very concerned about the way we're negotiating. We're not including yet the Afghani government in the negotiations. It's only between the United States and the Taliban. The Taliban continue to believe that the Afghan government are basically a bunch of traitors and puppets for the U.S. and they don't want to meet with them, right? So now, to be fair to the deal that Khalil Zaida is doing in Doha, part of the agreement is for them to initiate negotiation with the Taliban government. With the Afghan government. The Taliban wanted to meet with the Afghan government representatives on Norway as in their personal capacity, not in their official capacity, because they don't recognize
them.
The government over there. So how they deal with that and how they, create that dialogue between the Taliban and the Afghan government, that's something yet to be seen. If we continue the negotiations only between us and between the Taliban, that is not a withdrawal. That is another Saigon. That's how I see it, because, we're telling the Afghani government, we're telling the Afghani security forces, we're telling the Afghani army, we're out of here. And everybody remember what happened to Najibullah when the Taliban took Kabul and how they hung him from a lamppost. So the Taliban today control most of Afghanistan. They control more provinces in Afghanistan than any time since 2001. Really? Yeah. So they are in a position of power today.
18 years after U.S. troops in
more provinces are controlled
Afghanistan,
by
the Taliban has more territory today than it did at the time. Well, since
they lost Afghanistan back in 2000, because at one point they were
they were the country, right? Yeah.
So now, how are we going to bring the Afghani government to the table? How are we going to convince the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghani government? How are we going to convince the Taliban to participate in an election, right? Because if they don't want an election, that means they want a hostile takeover of the government. And that's exactly what's going to happen if they don't agree on a lot of these things. Look,
a hostile takeover of the government means
we pulling out, they taking Kabul, and Ghani will be like Najibullah. That's basically right. in a simple term.
And the repression of women.
Yeah, absolutely. everything is
no
gonna
human
go-
rights.
Yeah, I mean,
and potentially the Taliban.
they're
I mean,
already
ISIS
saying-
is rooted in Afghanistan now and could be protected by them.
All these things, human rights, women rights, it's all Sharia. It's all protected by Sharia.
Yeah.
Their version of Sharia.
Right.
We've seen their version of Sharia before 2001 when they controlled Afghanistan. So. Look, I think if you wanted to have a peaceful transition in Afghanistan, it's not only between the Taliban and the U.S. You have to bring all the different ethnic groups. You know, the Hazara need to be involved, the Tajik, all the different factions of the Pashtuns, not only the factions that's under the Taliban, and so forth. So we have many different ethnicities in Afghanistan, as you know. But also, at the same time, when you start bringing all these people, you have to bring the countries that's supporting them. So Iran need to be on the table. Pakistan. India, China, Russia. And if we don't do this, then the only thing we're doing is moving ourselves from the formula after we spend dear treasure and blood to create a new system, to create a new Afghanistan, a new security environment in Afghanistan. The people who are doing this, what I just talked about, a regional agreement on Afghanistan, are the Russians. And in February, they had a meeting in Moscow where different opposition groups, the Taliban, Iran, Pakistan, China, Russia, all of them were involved in a regional conference on Afghanistan. So I am very fearful that if we pull out from Afghanistan without a clear understanding of the transition, of the role of the Afghan government, of elections, and will Taliban participate in an election that they don't believe elections are Islamic or according to Sharia law? How other countries going to be involved in Afghanistan after we leave? I feel we will be just betraying the people who put all their eggs in our basket.
And once again, giving up American influence
Absolutely.
In the region.
Absolutely.
So we should not be withdrawing the troops the president is planning on withdrawing.
As I mentioned at the very beginning of the question, I think we should withdraw, but we should withdraw in a smart way, not in just negotiating a deal with the Taliban. Right. We need to, it's not enough to say, hey, Taliban, are you disconnecting your relationship with Al-Qaeda? Oh, yeah, we will do that. Okay, see you later, right? And I hope that won't happen. I hope that we have a lot of things in place. I mean, I'm very optimistic about trying to do a meeting in Norway with the Afghan government, but then what about all the different factions of the Afghan government, the different ethnic groups, the countries that support these ethnic groups? What's going to happen to all of them? I mean, this is not as simple as just having a negotiation between Taliban and us. It is more complicated. And the Pakistanis have interest, the Iranians have interest, the Russians have interest, the Indians have interest. A lot of times these interests contradict with each other. And now we are we have a lot of power in Afghanistan. And if we pull out by surrendering our power to the Taliban, that is going to weaken American influence in the region for decades to come.
One other matter I want to ask you about, we got the news the other day that the military commissions down in Guantanamo have set a trial date for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the rest of the 9/11 conspirators for 2021.
How many trial dates they have now?
Well, I think it's the first time it's formal trial. I know there's been two indictments leveled against this time and arraignments. In fact, I've covered 2 arraignments down there. But look, this is, so 2021, that would be 20 years after the 9/11 attacks. We finally get a trial.
Well, let's see what happens. I heard many times before that we set trial dates for something.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times we set trial dates for the coal and then it delays.
Right. You worked the coal case. And the guy you identified.
They're waiting for these guys to die in jail, man. Yeah. It's just like, there is no trial.
Right. I mean, do you think it'll ever come off?
I don't know. I hope for the sake of the families, for the sake of all these people who were murdered. I mean, think about it this way. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is the biggest mass murderer in the 21st century. He admitted He's proud of what he did. He admitted that he masterminded the 9/11 attack. And for almost 18 years, he has been in jail in Guantanamo Bay, and we cannot prosecute him.
Well,
What's wrong?
we could have prosecuted him.
We
If
could have
pursued a
Article
prosecution
3 court.
in an Article 3
Absolutely.
civilian court.
And I wrote about that, and I put even an op-ed in the New York Times about that, Article 3. But we're talking about the reality as it is. The reality as it is, they put them in Guantanamo thinking they are going to be tough on terrorism, and they are getting fat and happy in Guantanamo. Every now and then we see a picture of him with his red beard, and where the heck is he getting that dye, And he's like all healthy and big, and he's making a mockery out of our system.
Well, I always thought that this was the biggest legal mockery and fiasco,
Absolutely.
and perhaps in American judicial history.
And I
the
tell you,
idea
there is one reason
military,
behind it. One reason, one word: torture.
Right.
We did something, and we have no idea how to do a court case without talking about torture. That's it. And that's it. That's where we
it
are.
was
I think.
torture that you, Ali, tried to stop, as documented in that brilliant article on the wall over there. From Newsweek magazine.
My own experience and my own firsthand involvement. We did not get information from torture. We got information from regular techniques used by the intelligence and law enforcement communities, that techniques we've been using for decades and decades. All the stuff that has been in public about waterboarding, about enhanced interrogation techniques, about stuff that the president in 2006, President Bush said, Pidea and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the so-called dirty bomb, all these kind of things we did not get because of EIT nor because of torture. And I'm the only one who actually was able to raise his right hand in Congress and testify to that effect.
As we all remember.
And I think it's worth, particularly on this podcast, pointing out that it was Bob Mueller who listened to you,
right,
and who kept the FBI out of the torture business.
Yep, exactly.
At a time when the CIA and other agencies were involved.
This is when we were doing Abu Zubaydah, and when he figured out that when we reported to him, this is what's happening. He basically pulled us out and pulled the FBI out of all the black sites, and the FBI were not involved in any torture.
But coming full circle to the beginning of this conversation, he did not leak memos to the New York Times about this. Right. Yeah. Maybe he should have. Okay, Ali Soufan, thank you so much for once again being our guest on Skullduggery.
No, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you guys and talk to you.
We are joined now by Paul Barrett, the Deputy Director of NYU's Center for Business and Human Rights and the author of the rather alarming new report, Disinformation and the 2020 Election, How the Social Media Industry Should Prepare. Paul, welcome to Skullduggery.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
You, Iskoff, you forgot an illustrious part of his resume, which is that Paul is a former Justice Department beat reporter for the Wall Street Journal.
Sort of like you and me at one time, right?
An elite, that's right, an elite club here of former DOJ reporters. Yeah. But it means that he'll be able to answer a lot of questions that we routinely talk about on Skullduggery.
Core of impudent snobs, to coin a phrase once used by Spiro Agnew. Anyway, Paul, so fascinating report. We started off the show by playing that distorted video of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, in which it's deliberately slowed down to make her seem stupid and slurring her words and older than she already is.
Or drunk.
And what's interesting is, as you point out in the report, YouTube took that video down.
That's correct.
Facebook did not. Explain why not.
Yeah, Facebook was following its policy for false content. Under that policy, Facebook is looking for false content, trying to identify it, but when they find it, they basically demote it and annotate it. And by that I mean they push it down in the news feed so far fewer people will see it. They claim by 80%. And
they label it.
And they label it and tell you if you try to share it that this is false news and you shouldn't share it. But they leave it there available to be shared, to be liked, and to move around their site. And it's, to my mind and to the mind, I think, of many people, a peculiar policy. If they've gone to the trouble of identifying it as false, why not just take it out altogether? Now, for comparison purposes, to just think about the situation, think of the New York Times or the Washington Post. If they've identified a piece of information as false, they wouldn't go ahead and publish it anyway. Now, Facebook is not identical to the New York Times, but on the other hand, Facebook is not just like a set of plumbing pipes or something with no thought at all going on.
But this goes to their whole sense of who they are, their identity.
It does.
And they've always been adamant that they are not, they're not publishers, they're not the media, they're platforms, and they're there for the benefit of all Americans and people around the world to connect and freely express themselves.
That's right. But I think they're actually something in between publishers and a passive platform. They are making choices all the time. They're taking down and removing hate speech because that's what they do under their guidelines. They're taking down bullying and harassment. As of more recently, they are promising to take down voter suppression material. So they are capable of identifying a lot of this kind of material through a combination of their AI, artificial intelligence-driven filters, and human oversight. But they choose not to, in large part for the reason you're saying, that I think they're intimidated by the prospect of being made responsible for overseeing a lot more of what goes on their site.
This Pelosi example, I think, also points up a really interesting and important point that you make in this report, which is that, what has dominated the conversation of around disinformation has been foreign intervention, states like Russia that intervened in our election and manipulated social media. What your report says is that we should expect a lot more of this malign activity starting here in the United States domestically, and that's in some ways a bigger challenge legally, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when you have material coming from St. Petersburg and the Internet Research Agency run by the Russians, and you have Russians pretending to be Americans and putting out divisive material that's misleading from start to finish, what you do about that seems pretty straightforward. You remove that. They're being deceptive. They're foreigners trying to affect our elections.
And you may actually indict those people, as Robert Mueller did, right?
Exactly. It may be a conspiracy to commit fraud on the United States, absolutely. But when you have domestic actors doing the same thing, it looks superficially a lot more like ordinary, nasty American politics. And you begin to think, well, is there a problem with free expression here? Is there even a First Amendment problem? And you need to sort of very carefully unpack all of that and sort through it to see that, well, sometimes it might be advisable to leave material in place because it is just sort of dirty politics. But in other cases, if it's flat out just false, it would be permissible to take it down.
Well, look, I mean, a lot of campaign ads are deceptive and misleading in many ways.
Right.
We don't generally censure them.
That's right.
This is a tricky issue.
Absolutely.
As to how you handle this.
I'm not suggesting that there's an easy fix for this, or that the platforms can cure this overnight and at scale. The question is what you do when you are confronted with particular instances where your algorithmic filters and or your human reviewers, your content moderators basically bring you something and say, we think this is totally false, and you stare at it, you think about it, and you decide as quickly as possible, is it totally false or is it on the other side of the line? And these are going to often be difficult decisions.
But sticking with Issakov's example, I mean, if a political campaign is putting stuff out on Facebook or other social media platforms that are, I think to use the phrase in your report, demonstrably false, I mean, should that be taken down? I mean, we've been trying to expose that. That's the job of journalists do.
Right.
But should social media platforms, go after campaigns in that way?
No, in the main, No, I think that's where the idea of something being provably false, I think, is of some value. I just to sort of illustrate things, I have the contrasting examples in this report and in other reports I've written where you can look at something like the Sandy Hook massacre didn't really happen. The children were crisis actors.
It was a false flag operation.
That was a false flag
Something
operation.
pushed by Alex Jones of InfoWars on a regular basis for quite some time.
Correct. So that, on the one hand, I think actually is removable, even though some people would say it's just his opinion. But you could factually prove that didn't happen, just like you could factually prove that the Holocaust did happen. So if someone is basically using the existence of the Holocaust as an issue, I think you can fairly remove a fraud about that. On the other hand, if President Trump says something along the lines of the Democrats are in favor of open borders and crime, well, that's not really true, but you can't really prove what the Democrats are in favor of. And so I would just say you should err on the side of leaving that in place.
Look, the bigger picture from your report is just how much more sophisticated disinformation operations are becoming. We've spent so much time talking about what the Russians did in 2016. Your report shows that things are moving in many more sinister ways. So first of all, it's not just the Russians now. The Iranians have been involved in disinformation operations in the United States. The Chinese are expected to. Domestic actors inside the United States are using some of the same tactics. I mean, what should we expect in 2020, and how dangerous a threat is this to the upcoming election?
Yeah, I think we can expect a fair amount of chaotic activity where things are being projected via social media, and it will be difficult for people to sort out whether they're true or false. That's one thing. I think the dangers are a specific direct campaign to, for example, target a particular candidate with, for example, a false video, perhaps even a so-called deep fake video that is generated by artificial intelligence and is very difficult to identify as being fake. I think that's a kind of direct threat. More broadly, there's an indirect threat, which is just the underscoring of the cynicism that already exists. The fact that I think voters, there's a great danger that voters will, out of frustration, simply step back from the process altogether and not engage in it, be driven away from it because of their rising cynicism.
A couple of points I want to ask you about. First of all, you mentioned deep fake. Now, you pointed out to me as we were getting ready that the Pelosi video was a fake video, but it wasn't a deep fake video.
Right.
Why not? And what is a deep fake video?
Right. Deep fake video, it comes from a combination of the term deep learning with fake. And deep learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. And most deepfake videos use artificial intelligence basically to first create a fraudulent video from a material that depicts the target you're going to be going after, and then with another source of video imagery that can be projected onto the target, so you end up with someone seeming to be doing something they didn't actually do or saying something they didn't say.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure.
Have there been any? I mean, what's a deep fake video that's actually been out there?
Yeah, there was one last spring that was pretty convincing of Mark Zuckerberg that turned up on Instagram that showed him giving a talk where he seemed to be nefariously talking about sort of taking over all data and privacy and issues like that. The video was visually convincing because the creators of it were not actually trying to persuade people that Mark Zuckerberg had lost his mind or was a master villain. They used this sort of amusing script that went along with it.
It was satire. It wasn't. Yeah,
it was in that case, and actually it was left up. I mean, in large part because it was clearly satire. There's another well-known deepfake video that uses former President Obama's image, and the comedian and movie director and actor Jason Peele voices President Obama saying some outlandish and fascinating things that he didn't really say. Again, it's sort of medium convincing, but in the laboratory, so to speak, academics and others are showing that it is now possible to use this technology to make very convincing false videos.
And you could see one of these videos emerging the day of an election, for example, for a particular candidate.
About that. The impact that something like this can have in the last days or hours of an election is enormous and truly scary because, it takes time to call the creators of these fake videos out, before they're discovered. And in the meantime, they could be all over social media.
That's exactly right. That's kind of the direct threat. But then there's the more general threat, which is if we have a series of these, of say, deep fake videos that keep cropping up over time, and there are a series of disputes and debates over what's true and what's not true, that creates an overall environment, I think, where people are just alienated from the process.
Right.
And for point of comparison, I mean, maybe think about the way politics, such as it is, works in Russia, where people are very, very alienated from the process. Putin wins with 90+% majorities, and no one really believes anything about what's going on. Well, I fear that we are moving in small steps in that direction.
So this is potentially a real threat for media companies because, the way we try as hard as we can to verify every video that we run, and obviously, but we're a aggregation company, and how do you? What do you do if you're an editor at a media company and you're trying to discern whether a video is real or not? How can you fight against this?
Well, there are artificial intelligence programs specifically designed to detect deep fakes that can see the earmarks of it digitally and cause something suspect to be flagged. But I think the main answer is you have to go a little bit more slowly. I mean, before you put something that seems outrageous, the candidate appearing drunk at the child's little league game, you don't put it up. You have to figure out whether it really happened.
Now, we mentioned domestic actors getting involved in this space, and you give a very important case study, the New Knowledge matter. New Knowledge is a Austin, Texas-based social media research firm funded by Democrats who launched something called Project Birmingham to intervene and help manipulate and swing voters in the Alabama special election between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And they set up fake Facebook pages and Twitter accounts. Tell us what they did and what we know about it.
The basic goal was to confuse conservative Alabama residents, Republicans, over who to vote for and to dissuade them from voting for the actual main Republican candidate, who happened to be this controversial fellow, Roy Moore. And they did that in a variety of ways. In one case, they basically created a write-in campaign that they hoped would divert Republican votes to a hopeless write-in candidate, and that would hurt more. In another instance, there was an effort to set up a false Facebook organization that was allegedly pushing for a dry Alabama. And the idea, again, was to alienate Republican voters, moderate Republican voters, business people and
created
others.
by Baptist teetotalers, supposedly.
Right. And associating that with more,
Right,
thinking that if you elect more, this is the future for your state.
all the Republicans at the country clubs who enjoy their martinis and vodka and tonics after work would be alarmed if they thought that Roy Moore wanted a statewide alcohol ban.
Exactly.
So this was complete phony stuff, very much like what the Russians were doing in 2016, only this was liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
What was their justification for doing it?
Well, their facial justification was that they were doing an experiment to see how all of this might work, that they were not trying to throw the election for the Democratic candidate. I have to say that claim just seems, totally implausible. They may have initially gotten involved out of curiosity as to how it all might unfold, but I think once they were in the thick of it, they had to have been, pulling for the Democrat. They were funded by Democratic donors.
Yeah, Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, was a big backer of this, and there was a former Obama administration guy who was running it. Have there been any consequences of that? Has there been any investigation? Has anybody paid any price for this phony stuff?
Not that I know of.
Well, were any laws broken? What do you investigate?
Well, I suppose you could possibly. I'm not a prosecutor, so I want to.
Seems like an FEC
here.
violation. They're spending money to influence an election under phony pretenses. Did they report it? Did they disclose what they were doing?
Doug Jones, who was elected in that special election, called for investigations. I'm not sure that he really pursued that very vigorously. And so far as I know, nothing has happened. And the CEO of New Knowledge remains at the company. When I reached out to him just to get comment, that's where I found him, at the company. And
So for me, one of the fascinating kind of revelations in this report is the role that Instagram plays in disinformation, and the I think the outsized role that Instagram played in the Russian manipulation of the election and these Instagram memes. Right. Tell us a little bit about how Instagram is used for these purposes.
Well, it's very much what you just described. To a greater degree than most people realize, disinformation is perpetrated via images, not by extensive text. Mostly a still image with a caption superimposed across the bottom or the top or both. That's Instagram's bread and butter. That's what Instagram exists for, in a sense. And it was exploited more than people understand in 2016, and I reluctantly predict that it will be exploited again. And part of the reason is that Facebook, which owns Instagram, has not kept Instagram up to speed, even with what the main Facebook platform is doing in terms of fact-checking and trying to filter out false material. They are now belatedly, they've said that they're trying to do exactly that, get Instagram up to speed, but that's relatively late in the game. And
so they've been a negligent parent.
Yes, I think that's a fair characterization, and they're trying to make up for that now.
Why didn't we see a lot of this kind of disinformation in the 2018 midterm elections?
That's a good question, and I don't have a certain answer for it. I think it's fair to speculate that the Russians, to choose just one vector of disinformation, elected to keep their powder dry. That without a clear single candidate to get behind, as they did in 2016 with Trump, who they clearly favored over Hillary Clinton, it was, I think, perhaps less obvious to them, and I'm just speculating here, how to do good, help Trump in the much more complicated setting of congressional midterm election. Another factor that may have played a role at the margin was, a relatively new operation within the Pentagon known as the Cyber Command, was able for a few days, reportedly, to basically knock the Internet Research Agency offline.
So that might have rattled them.
That might have rattled them. There was also reporting that they may have reached out directly to individual trolls within the IRA and basically indicated to them, we know who you are, we know where you live, that kind of thing. None of this has been confirmed in a press conference setting by the government, but some of that activity is clearly going on. So that may have played a role.
shadow kind of cat and mouse game is fascinating.
You also talk about WhatsApp scare tactics.
Right.
Explain that.
Yeah. The concern there is that WhatsApp was badly abused in recent presidential elections in both Brazil and India, where it was the platform of choice for spreading all kinds of false rumors, false photographs, was used by campaigns in those countries. And so given that it's been shown that the platform can be used this way, and this is, of course, a very different kind of platform from the ones we've been talking about. This is not a public platform where you post things that lots of people can see. It's a messaging platform where the content is actually encrypted from end to end, as it's so to speak. But even in that supposedly more private connection, WhatsApp was abused. Now, there are a couple qualifications to that and reasons why Facebook believes it's less likely to happen in this country. WhatsApp is less popular in proportional terms in the United States than it is in Brazil or India. It just hasn't caught on as much in this country.
By the way, also owned by Facebook,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. That's right. And secondly, Facebook has taken a couple of laudable steps to reduce the reach of WhatsApp, specifically by limiting the number of WhatsApp groups you can forward material to at one time. It used to be that you could actually get material out on WhatsApp to tens of thousands of people, with basically, one click. Right. That's no longer possible. But we recommend in this report that they actually reduce that down to one. That at one click you can only reach one WhatsApp group.
Now, look, I mean, the basic thrust of your report is that social media companies need to do a lot more, starting with Facebook, of course. But look, the other side of the coin is, do we really want to deputize Facebook and these other Silicon Valley companies the power to censure what we read and what we see?
Yeah. Well, it's
and who are they to decide to be the determiner? Well,
the answer is who are they? They are the guys who own and operate the platforms. And I view it from the perspective that if they're going to operate those platforms, they need to do that responsibly. Your question is a fair one. But I guess another part of the answer is they are already superintending these platforms. Not anything doesn't just go. Yeah. They have rules against a significant number of categories of harmful content that they say just doesn't go in our walled off area that we take care of. This includes hate speech. It includes bullying. It includes child pornography and voter suppression material, and on and on. And I think it's necessary, it turns out, if you're going to run a large social media platform, it's necessary to have some type of oversight. Otherwise, all hell breaks loose.
Some would say the real answer is to break them up. Right.
Well,
and I think
I'm
people
not
in
sure
the government are talking about that.
If you had many more mini Facebooks, I'm not sure you'd have less of this kind of mischief. But certainly, the fact that the platforms have not been successful in controlling disinformation and other kinds of harmful content has added fuel to the demands to break them up.
So, Paul, you also suggest that ultimately users have some responsibility themselves to become more savvy, more literate when it comes to social media. Just in wrapping up here, what practical advice do you have to users out there about how to discern, legitimate information from information that's manipulated?
Well, I mean, I think the first general admonition would be, think twice before you share. Don't if you're titillated by something, don't just immediately send it, to everybody on your contact list. Think about what you're doing. Second, I think individuals need to think about, the qualities of the leaders that they get behind. Is it okay for a leader or would-be leader to routinely twist the truth?
Any leaders in particular you're thinking of?
Yeah, I would think of the disinformation purveyor in chief, which is the President of the United States.
So he's not just an expression of this problem. He is a driver of the problem.
That's exactly right. I mean, he's the main disinformation machine on Twitter. The Washington Post keeps track of misleading and false claims he makes, and they're up to 12,000 during his time in office. And I think he has set a tone that has facilitated all of the bad behavior that we've been talking about.
Well, I should point out that there is a video being made of this podcast, and I would invite AI specialists out there to do their own deepfake video, have Paul endorsing Donald Trump for president and praising Facebook, and then we could show it and as an example of the very threat that he's warning about.
I just like to say, to get ahead of the questions.
Yeah.
These beards that we have now, it's not a deep fake. These are real beards. They're beach beards, but they're real.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, Paul, thanks for joining us on Skullduggery.
You bet. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks to former FBI agent Ali Soufan and NYU's Paul Barrett for joining us on this episode of Skullduggery. Don't forget to subscribe to Skullduggery on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And tell us what you think. Leave a review. The latest episode is also on SiriusXM on the weekend. Check it out on POTUS Channel 124 on Saturdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with replays on Sundays at 1 a.m. and 3 p.m. Be sure to follow us on social media at Skullduggery Pod. Now you can watch the podcast on yahoonews.com, YouTube, and Roku, Saturdays and Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Talk to you soon.